Look, I just want to start by saying and acknowledging how great it is to be in a room full of people who I know are working to restore and protect and recover something that we've only really lost really significantly in the last, well, a little bit more than my lifetime. You know, it's less than a lifetime that food production has been transformed from a local affair to essentially a planetary web of supply chains that deliver a multitude of foodstuffs direct to our doorstep almost every day. And it would not exist but for one thing. You'll never guess what it is. Oil. Okay? The most flexible, the most powerful, and the most concentrated energy source on the earth. Now, do you know how many hours 1 barrel of oil represents in terms of expenditure of human energy? Anybody got a guess? 25,000 hours. That is 12.5 years at 40 hours a week, folks. It's no wonder we have problems kind of letting go. You know, that our addiction, we're kind of entangled in this, you know, it's kind of embedded. And it's only been 150 years. So sobering up from this is not easy, and that's particularly the case for the food system. From plowing the fields to the weekly run to the big box grocery store, we're fed by a global supply chain that's soaked in oil. You know what it is: fertilizers, pesticides, manufacturing and operation of machinery, tractors, irrigation pumps, processing equipment, plastic packaging, transport of all kinds, to the energy-sucking open freezers that we have in our big box stores. It's a miracle, but it's fraying at the edges. In North America, it takes 10 to 15 calories of energy, fossil fuel energy, to produce 1 calorie of food. I bet you it's not that much in Guinea-Bissau. That is huge dependency. In terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, it's a big deal, that kind of calculation. 20% is about what agriculture is producing, the food system, into carbon and other gases. The livestock industry alone represents 9% of global carbon emissions, 37% of methane, and a whopping 65% of nitrous oxide, which is 296 times as powerful as carbon is in terms of greenhouse gases. You know, they got a big problem in New Zealand. All the farting and burping and breathing of 40 million sheep, 9 million cows, and 2 million roe deer, that represents 50% of their carbon emissions. And when they wanted to become, the first country in the world to become carbon neutral, what were they concentrating on? Well, how do you get a cow to not fart so much methane, and so, there's a whole lot of pieces to this that we're just starting to come to understand. But there's other consequences, and some of you in this room know very well what they are. We've depended on cheap oil producing cheap food. 80 years ago, we spent 25% of our income in this country on food, right? Today, in Canada and the United States, it hovers around 10%. It's the lowest in the world, folks. And this may be good news for us as consumers, but for producers, it's not necessarily such great news. When I was born, the farmer got 40 cents. When I was 30 years old, still got 31 cents. I turned 60 this year. It's less than 20 cents. By the time I die, the farmers will be paying us in order to sell us the food. It's going the wrong direction for people who are trying to make a living. And I know I lived on a farm for 35 years, an operating farm with a family operation. And I know what it produced, and I know what it took. Net farm income. Now get this, because we're talking about creating a sustainable food system here. Net farm income in Canada in 2010 was the third worst since 1926, and the 6 years before that, plus 2010, were the worst period in that entire history in terms of farmers. Losses of income. So we've got some challenges. Concentration of ownership in the food industry is huge, it's energy intensive, and it's dominated by large corporate, shareholder-oriented, profit-oriented companies. I'm not going to go into all of that, but you know, there's 2 meat packers in this country that control 80% of the market, and we could go on and on and on. Where am I? Oh, I'm okay? Okay. Now here, I just want to tell you one weird one. It's just gone over the top. Have you heard of these multi-story pig factories? 1 million pigs? The cost per unit production, pretty damn good from an investor's point of view, apparently. But you know how much shit a pig makes every day? 8 times more than you and me. That every day is as much crap as BC and Alberta together. It's huge, and you know what? Who pays the costs? And who benefits from that? And why is all of that never taken into account in terms of price? Now, okay, so enough of that. It's not a resilient food system. It is vulnerable. It's become a web that's brittle and taut, and it's dangerous for everybody wherever we live in different ways. So, we know things have to change. The challenge is how. How do we organize ourselves and finance the transformation of a food system? Now, you're all part of this process. Part of your being here is to try and together kind of figure this out. So I want to tell you a story that will help us, I think, learn more about how do we go about doing this to rebuild local and regional food systems that have been hollowed out by globalization, fed by fossil fuels. The story starts in 1965 in Japan, and like many good stories, it starts with women. Their concern was the security and quality of their food supply. Hunger, they knew. The war was only 20 years away. And they worried about a number of trends: the farmland being lost, the farmers going off the land, the amount of imported food, the amount of pesticides going on the land, right? More and more of all kinds of things that were leading to less and less food security from their point of view. So they talked a lot about this, and then they took their talk and they walked over and they knocked on the door of a local farmer, and they said, well, you know, what we'd like to do is we'd like to have you provide us with fresh milk, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables that hasn't got chemicals on it. And the farmer says, well, you know, okay, but here's the deal. You go and you make sure you can buy all of our farm's production. And you organize the deal in terms of distribution and how that's going to work. So what was born is what was called Teikei. Teikei means partnership. But the philosophical meaning in Japanese means food with a farmer's face on it. Kind of like that better, eh? Food with a farmer's face on it. So, thus started a movement, which had at the heart of it a collective purchasing model made up of citizens who viewed their role as being, quote, living instruments for social and ecological well-being. Interesting, eh? And the movement grew rapidly. And the core of this collective purchasing is what they were called the Hans. They were like anywhere between kind of 7 and 20 people. They'd meet regularly, they'd plan their purchases. And it was not long before these various Hans started to meet their representatives with each other to aggregate their purchasing plans and to start to coordinate with a broader array of farmers. If you're wondering where community-supported agriculture came from, incidentally, you can trace its roots to this, just for those of you that may be interested. This led then to the incorporation of what's become known as the Saikatsu Consumer Cooperative. Okay? There are now 32 of these across Japan, and they're involved in organizing the purchases in their regions. Okay. Well, I'm not doing too bad. Okay, I'll make it, I think. Okay, so as they multiplied, right, they started to also get involved in other parts of the food chain. It's not just the production that has to change. The food chain and the supply chain has to be transformed. So they started to specify strict standards for the materials, production processes, packing materials, environmental practices, and they negotiated and used their purchasing power as it aggregated to have impacts along the supply chain to bring them in line with their ecological and social goals. Makes sense, eh? So, I'll give you an example. So, the normal superstore, you're not going to believe this, I couldn't believe this, I checked it 4 times, it goes up to 300,000 different items. Imagine. 300,000. In a normal co-op in Japan, it's 9,000. And in Saikatsu, they only have 1,600 staples that they deal with. Now, this is interesting. Less inventory, less cost, right? Much less waste. What does that translate into? Key to this is fair price in their philosophy to farmers. It's food with a farmer's face on it. You negotiate a fair price. You got to reorganize the system the way it's constituted in order to ensure that, and by them becoming active co-producers and impacting the system, they start to make this happen. Just to take one packaging matter, they only allow 8 bottles. Everything that's produced that goes into a bottle, there's only 8. You know how much carbon that saves every year? Just that one little innovation in carbon reduction is 2,100 tons a year, just from that one innovation. So we're thinking carbon, we're thinking of shortening supply chains, we're thinking of how are we going to create an ecological and social standards that might start to become what we want to see in the world and start to live in more alignment. Those are the kinds of things we need to think about. They also do audits with producers and consumers together, and they do spot visits. In 6 years, they did 719 audits involving 6,500 people. Well, that's a whole lot cheaper than third-party certification for organic food, but it also creates relationships. It also builds social capital. It builds trust. It is part of what we need to do if we're going to restore and reform the food system. Now, I want to tell you that today, from that beginning, 45 years ago, that system, it's not huge, but it's generating 1.1 billion in revenue every year. And here's what's really amazing. Now, think about this. Think about how we think in this country as consumers. These members put in $11 a month until they reach $3,500. That system has $1 billion in equity inside its system. And why do they do that? Can we even imagine our heads going there? Why do they do that? Well, here are 3 reasons. Financial stability, that's an easy one. Second, and this is important, they're not just customers. They are co-producers and co-investors in transforming the food system. And that is what we're going to have to think about as consumers, not just about producers and what we might do in terms of what we buy. It's not good enough, folks. We got to think a little bit more strategically, and it's a long-haul activity. The third thing, and this is really interesting, culturally, you heard our friend from Guinea-Bissau talk about the way they think about the food. They think that as citizens, they want to preserve their democratic autonomy. Get that? Their democratic autonomy. Wow, that really hits a nerve in individualism in our country, right? Okay, so I'm going to finish. I've got 12 seconds. I'm going to say Saikatsu means living people. That's what it means. I think it's an apt name. when we start talking about how we build a resilient food system. A system that's decentralized and modular, but it's connected and federated, right? That's a very important part of resilience. There's overlapping systems of governance, also very, because it creates some redundancies in the system, but yet it's very effective and it is efficient, but it takes a different kind of energy to make it work, not just fossil fuels. It's a system that sets ecological standards and where members and producers work together to ensure that these standards are realized. It's a system that's founded on the fundamental practice of fair price and fair trade. It's a system that creates and reinforces our interconnectedness as human beings and that respects the limits of the earth as a living system. Saikatsu, living people. An apt name indeed, and I think a challenge for all of us. Thank you.